So those of you who know me know that I generally speak about the combination. I wear two hats. I'm a rabbi and a historian. I like to combine the two, and tonight I'm going to be doing exactly that. This is my newest presentation. I actually created it prior to the elections in the States, and not with any specific agenda in mind, but just to give people some food for thought before they voted. And even though the elections are now passed, I think the topic is extremely interesting. It's actually two different topics. The first is dealing with some very recent discoveries regarding the impact of Jewish thought on political development in the modern world, specifically Western liberal democracy. And the second is a really fascinating sort of sociological, historical study of Jewish trends in voting and political affiliation, why Jews vote the way they do. So it sort of seems like two separate presentations, but I promise at the end I'm going to bring them both together because I think it's a very powerful message for all of us in the information I'm going to present. For those of you who've seen me do my original presentation, which is my first book, World Perfect, I start out by basically showing people how much Judaism has impacted the values of the modern world. And specifically, what I begin with in that presentation is demonstrating that the ancient world, even the sophisticated civilizations like Greece and Rome, despite their beautiful buildings and philosophy, the ancient world was a very brutal place. Almost every culture practiced infanticide. We had almost no concept of equal justice or social responsibility. Constant warfare. And Judaism brought into the world the values that basically have created, I would say, that utopian vision of values that all Western liberal society, and for that matter, pretty much the entire world, holds to be the ideal values. The value of life, peace, the notion of equal justice, education, family, which is not a value but an institution essential for all values, and social responsibility, the idea we have to take care of the world. Overwhelmingly, these values are a product, directly or indirectly, of the Jewish people. And a lot of great minds definitely focus on this when they talk about the Jewish impact on the world. For instance, Paul Johnson, the historian, writes, "Certainly the world without the Jews would have been a radically different place. To them we owe the idea of equality before the law, both divine and human, of the sanctity of life and the dignity of human person, of individual conscience and so of personal redemption, of collective conscience and so of social responsibility, of peace as an abstract ideal and love as the foundation of justice, and many other items which constitute the basic moral furniture of the human mind. Without the Jews, it might have been a much emptier place. It is almost beyond our capacity to imagine how the world would have fared if they had never emerged." And it's a wonderful quote. And of course, we have second President of the United States, John Adams, who wrote, "I will insist the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. If I were an atheist and believed in blind eternal fate, I should still believe that fate had ordained the Jews to be the most essential instrument for civilizing the nations. If I were an atheist of another sect, I should still believe that chance had ordered the Jews to preserve and propagate for all mankind the doctrine of a supreme, intelligent, wise, almighty sovereign of the universe, which I believe to be the great essential principle of all morality and consequently of all civilization. They are the most glorious nation that ever inhabited this earth. The Romans and their empire brought a bubble in comparison to the Jews. They have given religion to 3/4 of the globe and have influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other nation, ancient or modern." And like I always say, if he were running for president, I would definitely vote for him. This information, while not very well appreciated by most of the world, including a lot of the Jewish world, is not something that I discovered. It's out there. And this is something that the world appreciates. The Jews have had a monumental impact, directly or indirectly, in shaping that basic moral furniture of the human mind. Another point that is understood and known in history, and I also wrote about in my first book, World Perfect, is that when we look at the history of the evolution of these ideas in Western consciousness, if we go back 1,000 years ago, to the time when the Catholic Church was the most powerful institution in feudal Europe, ironically, the church, which was, of course, totally God-centered, was very different in terms of what it was actually doing in the world. You know, the Catholic Church actually maintained a list of banned books, an index, and the top of the list was the Bible. And people say, what? The Catholic Church would ban the Bible? First of all, in medieval Europe, the Bible was only written in Latin. Most people couldn't read anyway, and they didn't understand Latin. But even if you could read and could understand Latin, you couldn't access a Bible because the church, being the largest player in feudal Europe, and being very much into the whole system of incredible social injustice that feudalism characterized, anyone reading the Bible and looking how the church behaved would be shocked at the disconnect. And if you know your history of the evolution of Christianity in Europe, starting in the 16th century, Martin Luther, who's the founder of Protestantism, his whole break with Catholic Church was exactly over this point. That number one, the church was being hypocritical. It was doing the exact opposite of what the Bible was preaching. But more than that people shouldn't need to go through popes and saints to connect to God. People should go to the Bible itself. So unlike Catholicism, which was trying to keep the Bible out of view, one of the great inventions or innovations of Protestantism was to bring the Bible back in. Literacy, by the way, jumps tremendously. It happens to correspond with the printing press, pretty much the same period of time, so people could now get books. But the whole summons of Protestantism was that people should go directly, read the book, have a direct relationship with God. This, by the way, if you know your history of Europe, triggers a lot of tension. Religious wars between Protestant and Catholic countries. If you know your history of the relationship between Spain and England, for instance. Another thing that we know, which is well appreciated for those of us in America, especially you guys, people living in New England and northeastern United States, is that much of the United States was initially settled by various splinter sects of mainstream Christianity who left Europe seeking greener pastures, freer pastures to practice their religion. The most famous being, of course, the images you see here, the Pilgrims. Okay? Here you have Plymouth Rock. Everyone thinks it's this huge rock. There it is. Look at this. But these people literally viewed their physical journey as a historical sort of reenactment of what the ancient Hebrews had done thousands of years before. Meaning that Europe was Egypt. Okay, the Atlantic Ocean was what, therefore? The sea that splits. You know, America was the promised land, and Plymouth Rock is, believe it or not, Mount Sinai, albeit in miniature. No, but they were literally making a new covenant. These people were really into the Hebrew Bible. Many of the legal codes of the early American colonies in the 17th century are based on citations from Scripture, meaning the Hebrew Bible. Now, this is something, again, which is not a big secret. It is well appreciated that these extremely religious early settlers were very into the Hebrew Bible. By the way, this influence, even though these people will, of course, become the minority in what will later be the early American colonies and eventually the United States, that influence seeps all the way into early America in many ways that are fascinating. For instance, many of the early universities in the United States, you could give the commencement addresses. Bible was, of course, taught, and even Hebrew was taught. You could give the commencement, the graduation speeches in Greek, Latin, or in Hebrew in many of these universities. By the way, one of the goals of these universities was to train people to proselytize the Native Americans, the Indians, to make them Christian. I've even seen letters of Ezra Stiles from Yale University, early 18th century, writing in beautiful Hebrew to Rabbi Mendes Satius in Newport, Rhode Island, one of the earliest, any of you visited the synagogue? One of the earliest synagogues in the United States, where George Washington even visited. It even spills over into the emblems of a lot of the schools, upper left-hand corner. Anyone recognize what that is? Yale University. What does it say there? Urim v'Tumim. What's Urim v'Tumim? Well, not the literal trend. It's the vest plate worn by the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, in the temple. Bottom left, that's Dartmouth. And if you could see, it's a little bit hard to see, but it says Kael Shakai, the all-powerful God, and the triangle in the center. Upper right-hand corner, Columbia University. Look what it says, Yud Ke Vav Ke, the four-letter tetragrammaton, the name of God we don't even pronounce. This is the coolest of all. This is not a university symbol. This is the proposed first great seal of the United States of America, proposed by Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin. Now we have today the eagle with the E pluribus unum thing, but this was the original idea. It's a picture of the sea splitting, the pillar of fire, Pharaoh drowning in his chariot, the Jews standing on the shore, and it says, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. And of course, the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, with the quote from the book of Leviticus, proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. I mean, again, this is not something I discovered. It's again, known but not well appreciated how much the Bible shaped America. 16th, 17th century, even 18th century, place names too all over, Salem and old Shiloh, and you name it, it's there. It even spilled into the ideology behind the founding fathers of the American Revolution, although they were far less, I would say, fanatically into the religion as some of their earlier settlers in the United States. Again, this is something I didn't discover. It's known, it's appreciated. But what I did discover, I didn't figure it out, but I recently discovered it myself, and I feel it's a very important point, came out of a book review that someone sent me a couple of years ago. It's a small book called The Hebrew Republic. The author is Eric Nelson. He's an Oxford scholar who I believe is now teaching at Harvard. I'm not 100% sure of that. But when I read the review, within 5 minutes, I went and ordered the book on Amazon. That's how my parents know I'm coming to America. The books start showing up. And it's a little book, but with a huge impact. And it goes back to a point which, depending upon how old you are, this is how I learned history of the modern world. When we study our world history, the way I learned it was 1,000 years ago, Europe was medieval. And the church reigned supreme. Before that, you had the classical period of Greece and Rome, but those civilizations collapsed. And you had the otherworldly, spiritual, medieval period, the Dark Ages. What comes in the next period of European history? 1350 to 1650 is known as the Renaissance. What does Renaissance mean? Rebirth of what? The classical knowledge, the humanistic, the human-centered worldview of the Greeks and the Romans. So it's already a step away from religion. And then from 1650 to 1850, what's the next period of time in European history? The Enlightenment. And what's the theme of the Enlightenment? The victory of science and rationalism and reason over religion, basically. And finally, because secular comes into being and rational thought and religion is pushed aside, we now have the modern liberal democratic rational world of today. Did anyone learn their history like this? This was like, you know, like on the 10 Commandments of history. This was like given, accepted as absolute fact. It's a great proof of the fact that, by the way, not even God can change history, only historians can, which is true. I mean, history can always be skewered. And there's a certain view which is actually not correct, which Eric Nelson does a beautiful job in his book of showing is actually not correct. What he shows is the opposite, that the reality is in the early modern period, 16th and 17th century especially, that many of the greatest minds of that period were totally into the Bible. They were truly the Hebraic scholars. And I want to look at one quick quote from Eric Nelson, and he sums it up beautifully. Contrary to what we thought about the modern world coming out of the world separating itself from religion, Eric Nelson says it was rather in the 17th century, in the full fervor of the Reformation, that political theology re-entered the mainstream of European intellectual life. The Protestant summons to return to the biblical text brought with it incessant appeals to God's constitutional preferences as embodied in Scripture. During this period, Christians began to regard the Hebrew Bible as a political constitution designed by God himself for the children of Israel. They also came to see the full array of newly available rabbinic materials as authoritative guides to the institutions and practices of this perfect republic. The idea being basically, as Europe is going through massive political transformation and people are looking for a role model, ideas of how to create a new political order, if you believe that God is perfect and he gave the Bible, then therefore the system of government that's in the Bible by definition has to be perfect. And most of the greatest thinkers of this period of time, 16th, 17th century, were these Hebraists. When I say Hebraists, it doesn't mean they liked Hebrews. You have to always distinguish between people who like Jews in theory or ancient Jewish people in the Bible or in those stories, but can't stand living next to Jews in their own lifetime. By the way, even people like John Adams was not a big lover of Jews, personally. He loved Judaism. The Crusaders loved King David. They loved the Maccabees as they slaughtered a third to half the Jews in Europe, 1,000 years ago. So don't confuse the two. That's not our topic, who likes Jews and who doesn't. But we're talking about we're not talking about little guys here. We're talking about the biggies. People like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke. You guys heard these names? He's the father of liberalism. Hugo Grotius, the father of international law. John Selden, David Harrington. Unbelievable how many of these people were obsessed with the Bible, which means or they learned Hebrew or they had these texts translated into Greek or Latin so they could go to the sources. Now, what's interesting also is today the Christians that we know that are into the Bible are whom? Which population of Christians? We all know them. The evangelicals. But they're literal scripturalists. What's a literal scripturalist? They only have access to the Bible, usually in translation, and they take it literally. Their source of knowledge about Judaism comes from there. We never learn Jewish law from a Bible. There's a whole corpus, a whole body of information of the oral tradition. These guys, these big guys in the 16th and 17th century, they knew it also. if we want to create a political system based on Jewish law, we have to have access to all Jewish law, which means, of course, they studied the Bible. But they also studied the Mishnah and the Talmud and the Midrash and the great commentators, people like the Rambam and Rashi and the Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, the great medieval commentators. And they learned through these ideas from the statements in the Bible, following through their development in the oral law to practical application in a very similar way that today, when Jews learn in yeshiva and they're sitting there studying Talmud and working through Jewish law, in a similar style to that. They didn't enroll in yeshiva, they didn't invite rabbis in, but they learned it in a similar fashion. And what do you think was the most interesting thing, or the thing they were most interested in studying in terms of what kind of government to set up? They were interested in looking at what does God think of one particular institution. What's the institution that has largely vanished from Western government today? Only a couple of them exist as figureheads. I'll give you a clue. One lives in Buckingham Palace and she's great for tourism, but she pays taxes and has no political power. The Queen of England, right? Monarchies. Monarchies. And what do you think by the way, the story they focused on is a famous story in the Hebrew Bible about when the Jewish people first make a king, which is the story of Samuel, the last of the judges, one of the great prophets of Judaism. When he's old, the Jewish people come to him and ask, they say, we've been going like 400 years with no strong central authority. We want a king now. Now what's interesting is if you know your Jewish law, one of the 613 commandments is appoint a king. Som tasim alecha melech. So it seems that the Jewish people are only asking to fulfill one of the 613 commandments. Yet if you read the narrative in the Bible, what does God say to Samuel? He says, Samuel, don't be upset. They haven't rejected you. They've rejected me. What do you think? What do you think the founding fathers of America, the conclusion they came to? Does God like kingship or doesn't like kingship? Of course not. Here's a great one, Thomas Paine. We're getting a lot of New Rochelle history here. Thomas Paine, one of the great thinkers of the American Revolution, he was a pamphleteer. Today he'd be a blogger. Okay, but he's BC, before computers. But he wrote a pamphlet called In Common Sense. Now, Thomas Paine was not like an evangelical fundamentalist Christian by any stretch of the imagination. Nonetheless, you could see the impact of the Bible on his political thought process. And when a man seriously reflects on the idolatrous homage which is paid to the person of the kings, he need not wonder that the Almighty, ever jealous of his honor, should disapprove of a form of government which so impiously invades the prerogative of heaven. And of course here, look, Samuel Langdon, president of Harvard, Congress of Massachusetts, 1775. You can see how much he's looking into the Bible. The Jewish government, according to the original Constitution, which was divinely established, if considered merely in civil view, meaning not as a religious book, but as a political constitution, was a perfect republic. The civil polity of Israel is doubtless an excellent general model. What's the point we should take away from this? That contrary to what we thought before, the influence of Jewish thought, legal thought, the Bible did not disappear with the medieval period. It followed all the way up through the early modern period, and even though it is less intense by the time of the American Revolution, it continued to play a critical role in the political development of the modern world. And as we see, since a perfect quote for this part of the world, Woodrow Wilson, 28th President of the United States and former President of Princeton University, writes, recalling the previous experience of the colonists and applying the Mosaic law to the order of their internal life, it is not to be wondered at that the various passages in the Bible that serve to undermine royal authority, stripping the crown of its cloak of divinity, held up before the pioneer Americans the Hebrew Commonwealth as a model government. In the spirit and essence of our Constitution, the influence of the Hebrew Commonwealth was paramount in that it was not only the highest authority for the principle that, quote, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God, unquote, but also because it was in and of itself a divine precedent for a pure democracy as distinguished from a monarchy, aristocracy, or any other form of government. Nice summary from someone, from a local. Okay. Let's put that on hold. It's a fascinating topic. By the way, if anyone's interested in reading more, you'll send me an email. I'll give you this. The Eric Nelson's book has now spawned a whole new exploration of the impact of political Hebraism in the early modern period. There are tons of books written on it now. Send me an email. I'll send you the whole reading list. But now let's switch gears. And again, we're going to do like it's a different topic, but we're going to bring them back together. This is Jewish political affiliation. Now, in the case of this particular presentation, I'm focusing basically on America, although the rules are more or less the same for Jews in the Western world today. I picked America because I am American, B, I give the talk mostly in America. But C, it's by far the largest diaspora community where we have the best statistics on Jewish voting patterns. And because Jews, albeit not a huge percentage of American population, nonetheless play a very significant role in the American political process. And it's fascinating. You know, if you look at Jewish political affiliation in the modern world, how do Jews tend to vote? We have two options here. Democrat, or we associate with liberal, outside of America we call liberal, versus Republican, conservative. What do you think? Overwhelmingly Democrat. Okay, overwhelmingly, as we'll see in a minute. What percentage of Americans, by the way, define themselves as liberal? What do you think? 40, 70, 28%. Okay, the vast majority of Americans consider themselves in the center and swing back and forth. Otherwise, you'd never have different Democrat, Republican presidents. But how about the Jews? What percentage of Jews define themselves as liberal? 73%. A very significantly higher number than the average American, than the American population at large. But pretty much in the entire 20th century into the 21st century, this is the way it's been. It wasn't always that way, by the way. This is voting patterns from 1916. But if we go back to the 1800s, we see that, by the way, this is pre all the Russian Jews coming in, which is most of our grandparents, or great-grandparents, I should say, between 1882 and 1914. You know, 2.5 million Jews came to the United States from what was the Russian Empire. And when they mainstream into society and start voting at this period of time, then you see this pattern. But prior to that, it was mostly German Jews, a much smaller percentage, much fewer Jews, who tended to, by the way, be Republican. Pretty much every single president, beginning with Woodrow Wilson onward, Jews have voted on average, give or take, up to 20%. About 3/4 have gone to Democrats, starting with Woodrow Wilson. Why Woodrow Wilson? Why do you think he first captured the interest of the Jewish voter? He supported three things that were very attractive to Jews. One was the nomination of Louis Brandeis as the first American Jewish Supreme Court justice. Two was he supported the Balfour Declaration, calling British support for a Jewish state. And three was the creation of the League of Nations. And as we'll see later, Jews are obsessed with top-down solutions to the world's problems. They will always support anyone who's into those things. But pretty much from then on, peaking out with people like Roosevelt, who after Moses is the most popular political leader in Jewish history, getting 90% of the vote, the only exception being Jimmy Carter round 2, when he only got like 45%, because he was just so bad for Israel. But otherwise, this has been the way it's been on a national level. It's always been this way for over 100 years. When I say national, not just president. We're talking about the Senate and the Congress also, as we see over here. I just updated these statistics. We lost 3 Jews total. It was 36 prior to the most previous election. But Jewish representatives in the House and the Senate, there's a total of 33. If you look in the Senate, we got 11 representatives, of whom we got 10 Democrats and 1 independent. No Republicans. If we look in the House, 22 representatives. That's a lot. For Jews are what percentage of the population of America, by the way? 1.7% and shrinking. But 22 representatives, and look at this one. 21 Democrats and only Eric Cantor, the one Republican. It is extremely lopsided, the overrepresentation of Jews on a national level for Democratic political position. By the way, on local elections, makes no difference. Whatever the issues that affect the Jewish community in that area, they vote personally on those issues. But the question is why? And by the way, this is a real anomaly. This is an anomaly that has attracted the attention of many political analysts and authors. I've found an amazing number of articles on Jewish voting patterns. This one is very interesting. It's Anna Greenberg and Kenneth Wall. The title is Still Liberal After All These Years. I think it's based on that Paul Simon song. But look what he says. It's from Jews in American Politics, 2002. They say, Jewish Americans do not exhibit the same political tendencies as other demographically equivalent groups. For instance, we might expect Jewish Americans to become more conservative in their beliefs and voting preferences as succeeding generations attain higher levels of affluence and education. In fact, Jewish Americans are among the most highly educated, professional, and affluent members of the population. But when we compare these Jewish American voters to non-Jews with the same socioeconomic status, the Jews remain politically distinctive, which is a nice way of saying what? They continue to remain loyal to the Democratic Party, okay, which is interesting. Now, this is a pretty, as we say in Jewish speak, parv. Okay, I mean, he's not making any judgment call here. Now, there's another author, his name is Norm Potteritz, who is the editor of Commentary magazine, who is an octogenarian now. He's one of the early neoconservative thinkers. He's a little less parv, because he's a conservative thinker. But nonetheless, his comments are very interesting in the book he wrote called Why Are Jews Liberal? I even have a few footnotes in his book, which I thought was quite cute. But anyway, he says, in short, Jewish political behavior continues to contradict many commonplace assumptions. If we go by the most commonplace of all these assumptions, that people tend to vote their pocketbooks, we are forced to conclude that in continuing to vote for the Democrats, Jews have, and in the last few decades, been voting against their own interests. Jewish liberals, which is to say most Jews, take pride in it as a mark of their refusal to put self-interest, which they equate with selfishness, above the demands of social justice. And although he's obviously coming from a position of being a conservative critiquing this, the point he's making is quite interesting in that we would assume that as Jews work their way up from the bottom, like your great-grandparents, immigrants, Lower East Side, dirt poor, to being the wealthiest group in the United States, and of course it's the general perception that the Republicans are for less taxes and the Democrats will tax the rich more, how would we expect Jews to vote? They're going to move to the Republican side, yet it hasn't happened. The way people say it, it's a little bit, I don't know, politically incorrect, but a very funny line. Jews earn like Episcopalians, yet they continue to vote like Puerto Ricans. It's not my original line, but I think it's a very interesting way of summing it up. But the question I'm focusing on is not what's right or wrong here, but why are Jews such an anomaly? If you know about what I teach, Jews are always an anomaly. We always break all the rules. But this one is very insightful into the Jewish personality. So Potteritz goes into a bunch of explanations in his book trying to figure out why Jews vote the way they do. And there's something to what he says, for sure. Number one, the idea that, of course, Jews coming from like Tsarist Russia, for instance, which was right-wing, reactionary, Christian, anti-Semitic, brutal government, would naturally, when they come to America, go the other way politically. Anything antithetical to where they came from. Not only that, the perception was, certainly 100 years ago, that the left, the liberals, advocate for the underdogs. The Protestant elite, the Republican conservative, that's for the status quo of the wealthy. Meanwhile, those immigrant populations, they would be represented, the workers, the lower class, by the left, by the liberals, by the Democrats. And also the notion that, given that you had this, remember you used to have in America, you don't have it anymore, but restricted country clubs and neighborhoods and hospitals Jews couldn't get into. Jews were trying to mainstream into society, and they felt the way to do that would be, of course, the liberal, the democratic side of things. Now, by the way, there's definitely something to all of this. The problem with this list is twofold. Number one, it's no longer relevant to us, okay, as Jews. This is stuff that was relevant to our grandparents, okay, for sure. But number two, Norm Potteritz was missing, in my opinion, one thing, because he's just coming in from a sociological, historical point of view, but I, wearing history and rabbi hats at the same time, I believe that there's another point we have to look into, which he doesn't touch on. He would never touch on it, but it's a mainstream point of Jewish worldview. And it's a point that has to do with what we call spiritual genetics. But before we jump into that, I just want to throw you one more quote, because it's a great flip into the question of why Jews are the way they are politically. And it goes back to a quote from Ernst van den Haag, who's a Dutch-American sociologist. He did not invent the ice cream. People think he did. Van den Haag, Haagen-Dazs, whatever. Someone told me he's actually Jewish. His probably name is Steve Horowitz, and he probably figured he'd sell more books if he took on Van den Haag. By the way, this book is hysterical. I have like 3 copies of it. Look at the titles, It says, Jews make better doctors, more aggressive lawyers. Do I have to be Jewish anymore to charge interest? Jews and sex. Never mind. Okay, didn't see that. Okay. It's a bizarre book, but it's very entertaining. Came out in 1969. But you should get a copy. You can get them used still, I think. But look what he says. It's a very powerful quote. He's onto something huge when he says the following. Utopian dreams, millennial prophecies, and messianic expectations are as much a part of the Jews' cultural heritage, as is the practical worldly attitude. He's saying we're complicated. We're very utopian, but we're practical. With emancipation, Jews have tried to influence their actual environment in this world, but they have not given up their dreams. Many have become reformers, many others have become radicals. Of all groups, Jews are most prone to expectation of radical change. Although very few Jews are radicals, very many radicals are Jews. Out of 100 Jews, 5 may be radicals, but out of 10 radicals, 5 are likely to be Jewish. What attracts them so disproportionately to radical causes? And anyone who remembers the 60s, A.B. Hoffman, and Jerry Rubin, it's unbelievable how many Jews. Kennedy founds the Peace Corps, Jews, 2.3% of the population, a third of the volunteers. Freedom Riders in the South, unbelievable disproportionate number of Jews. We are obsessed with changing stuff. The question is why? The answer to this is not a modern historical explanation of past Jewish experience in Russia or anything. It goes back to the very essence of who we are, to a concept that I mentioned before, spiritual genetics. It's a Jewish concept that we all took biology, right? That we all get genes. We're a product physically of our parents. My wife always says it's not fair. The women do all the work and the kids look like the father anyway. But this is something that no one debates. We all took biology. You can measure it in a microscope. Judaism says there is actually an idea of spiritual genetics. There are traits you pass on. And the Jewish idea, going back to the beginning of the human race, is that the early nations, almost none of whom exist today, they're all gone pretty much, were basically founded as a family. A man and a woman had kids, and then his kids had kids, and eventually what started out as a family becomes a nation. And that nation not only could be traced back biologically to its origins, to its antecedents, but also they had traits that were innate in who they were, which means if you were living in the world thousands of years ago, you'd like bump into a guy on the street and he'd say something to you and you'd go, "What a Moabite." Well, that's such an Ammonite thing to do, The problem is these guys are basically gone. But we, who've outlasted everyone, still have the traits. Now, while for every person who's Jewish, there's a lot of people who should be who aren't anymore, and a lot of people have joined the Jewish people throughout history, the essential core of who we are, by the way, even genetically, comes from all the way back to Abraham and Sarah. And I always say if you want to understand who we are, you just got to look at them. Because they're us. We are the macro, they're the micro of what the Jewish people is about. The essence of Abraham really says it all. His greatness, and I say this all the time when speaking about this topic, is twofold. It's clarity and commitment. Abraham comes up with such a radically creative, wild idea that forget all the polytheism and every force of nature as a God that governs it. Abraham reconnects humanity to the concept of one infinite God. That is a pretty radical idea. That makes Einstein's general relativity look like kid stuff. But the other greatness of Abraham is he is a truth seeker. He has a drive for meaning. He doesn't care what anyone thinks. He wants truth regardless of consequences. That's the commitment. He says, I choose to live and if necessary to die for the reality of God. And Abraham and Sarah have children who become a family that turn into a nation. And that nation embodies those character traits. And the trait that I think best summarizes the Jewish people is, of course, the word drive or driven. Jews are disproportionately driven people, which makes sense, by the way. To stand up to the whole world, to push through what is the ultimate mission in human history, to reconnect humanity to absolute meaning, to ultimate morality, to the idea of one God, that requires tremendous drive. We are bulldozers, the Jewish people. Now, there's non-Jews who are driven also, but Jews are overwhelmingly disproportionately driven people. By the way, the drive's a raw force. It's in us whether we're connected to Judaism or not, which, by the way, explains a point which is so obvious, the fact that Jews are so disproportionately impactful in the world. And when I go around on airplanes, which I'm sadly doing all the time on speaking tours, which is why I married a travel agent, I love asking non-Jews how many Jews there are in the world. You know, they generally give me numbers 10 to 100 times higher than there really are. I've had at least a dozen Gentiles tell me there are as many Jews in the world as Chinese. Why do they say that? Yeah, because we're spread out everywhere and disproportionately impactful. I did have a guy tell me on a plane years ago, everyone in Hollywood is a Jew who got a nose job and changed his name. I said, you're a little anti-Semitic, but 50% correct. But anyway, the reality is, far from being 20% of the world's population, or whatever the Chinese are today, we're 0.2% of the world's population. But it also explains why Jews in America are 1.7% of the population, make up 10% of the professionals on average, 10% of the student body and faculty of every college and university. The better the school, the more the Jews, like the Ivy Leagues, 25, 30% Jewish. And it's not just in America. You go to Germany, pre-Nuremberg laws and Hitler, Jews are 0.6% of the population, but 10% of the professionals. And by the way, 30% of the retail in Germany pre-Nuremberg laws was owned by Jews. That's ridiculous. That's like that joke, why did God create Gentiles? Someone had to buy retail. It was unbelievable. Medieval Europe, no matter how you slice it, you see this Jewish drive. What's the benchmark for excellence in the world? Is an award. Nobel Prizes. Jews are 0.2% of the population. How many Nobel Prizes should we have? None. How many do we have? About 24% of all the Nobel Prizes since 1900. It's ridiculous. By the way, the drive isn't always good. Trust me. Whatever we do in this world, as we'll see, we do bad stuff big also. Biggest stock market scandals, Ivan Boesky, Bernie Madoff with $65 billion in a Ponzi scam, organized crime. We do it big. Jews are not into. We are driven, always push, push, push. And if we're not connected to the national historic mission of Abraham, we're just going to rise. But the word that best categorizes us, and you have to understand also, is chutzpah. Most non-Jews can't even say the word. They can't say tochas either, don't worry. But what does chutzpah mean? Nerve. But it makes total sense to be a people who's into meaning and doesn't care what anyone thinks, to want truth regardless of consequences. You gotta have chutzpah. If you understand these two traits, then we begin to understand Jewish political affiliation. We are think outside the box, always want to change the world kind of people, who, by the way, are always very concerned and sensitive. There's one more aspect to throw in. The rabbis say that Jews are rachmanim, baishanim, v'gomle chasidim. We are merciful, we are modest, and we love to do kindness. We always obsess, often at our own expense, on the welfare of everyone else in the world. These are traits that, if we understand, go very back to the beginnings of who we are, explain a huge amount about why we do what we do, and all the non-Jews see the disproportionate impact and how we are always moving and changing the world. For instance, Mark Twain, whose real name is Samuel Clemens, who holds 7 patents for dun, 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 suspenders. Now you know. Okay, he does. He invented suspenders. If you win that question on a game show, I won 10%. But he says, if the statistics are right, the Jews constitute but 1% of the human race. It suggests a nebulous dim puff of smoke lost in the blaze of the Milky Way. Properly, the Jew ought hardly to be heard of, but he is heard of, has always been heard of. He is as prominent on the planet as any other people, and his commercial importance is extravagantly out of proportion to the smallness of his bulk. His contributions to the world is listed in great names in literature, science, art, music, finance, medicine, and abstruse learning are also way out of proportion to the weakness of his numbers. He has made a marvelous fight in this world in all ages and has done it with his hands tied behind him. Perfect quote to summarize the disproportionate Jewish impact and drive. And there's another great quote from Van den Haag that I love. He talks about how Jews are such creative, think outside the box people. He says, asked to make a list of the men who have most dominated the thinking of the modern world, many educated people would name Freud, Einstein, Marx, and Darwin. Of these 4, only Darwin was not Jewish. In a world where Jews are only a tiny percentage of the population, what is the secret of the disproportionate importance the Jews have had in the history of Western culture? By the way, of these 4, Darwin was the most religious, and he's the one who looks like a rabbi. He does. And Darwin was not an atheist at all, by the way. But what the point is fascinating, because these are some of the most, right or wrong, and a lot of these ideas are wrong, these are some of the most transformative ideas that have shaped the modern world. Yet they come from a people who's less than 1% of the world's population. We're always thinking outside the box. Now, one of my favorite Jewish personalities in the world today, and I believe he should be made the speaker for the Jewish people, is Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Sachs, who's from England. He's the chief rabbi about to resign the position after 20 years, I believe. First of all, everything, with a beautiful British accent, everything sounds intelligent. My wife has one, I know this. When she tells me to take out the garbage, I'm like, oh, that's so smart. Anyway. But no, seriously, he's a brilliant speaker. He's an incredibly intelligent human being. And I want to show you a quote in just a minute. But before we get to his quote, look at this quote from Goethe. This is the final quote of a person who's no longer in the world. Goethe says, energy is the basis of everything. Every Jew, no matter how insignificant, is engaged in some decisive and immediate pursuit of a goal. It is the most perpetual people of the earth. That should be our motto, this last line. Every Jew should have the PPE thing on, the DD, whatever. Perpetual people of the earth. We are always on the move, always changing things. But the last quote I want to look at is fascinating because of all the things that Jews have been into in human history. In terms of political movements and ideology in the modern world, there's one political movement that is not only a creation of Jews, but has been spread by the Jewish people for over a century. What am I talking about? What's the political ideology which was created by Jews, spread by Jews, and continued to be largely spread by Jews in the world, although less so, certainly, than... Yeah. Communism and socialism, which are not the exact same thing, but they're connected for sure. Communism was invented by whom? Actually, Moses Hess. Moses Hess, who's also often considered the earliest Zionist, taught Marx, who was Jewish but converted to Christianity, and Engels, who was not Jewish. And you look at the whole history of the Russian Revolution, Zamenhof, Zinoviev, Leon Trotsky, besides Lenin, it's a Jewish event. The whole history of socialism in the West is a who's who of Jews. Why are Jews so driven to this particular political ideology? The person who got it perfectly is Edmund Wilson. Edmund Wilson is an American literary critic from the early part of the 20th century. And it's a great quote because he completely gets the Jewish personality. He says, the Jew lends himself easily to communism because it enables him to devote himself to a high cause involving all of humanity, characteristics which are natural to him as a Jew. He gets both points that are huge. One is we're always trying to change the world. So any holistic, big, high cause, top-down solution, which is progressive political thinking, by the way. You guys know the term progressive? It's not used so much today. It was used huge in the early 20th century. Futurism, fascism, communism, socialism, they're all considered progressive movements. The notion of change in the world, dramatic, rapid change, always have attracted Jews. By the way, it's going to sound weird, but I know it to be true. Had Hitler not been an anti-Semite, Jews in Germany would have been gaga for Nazism, which, by the way, is a left-wing political ideology, not a right-wing political ideology. Now, seriously, it's called National Socialism. It's funny because when someone on the left wants to insult someone on the right, they always call them a Nazi or a fascist. Both those ideologies are progressive left-wing ideologies, but that's not my topic. But here, characteristics are natural to him to as a Jew. It's in our very blood to always want to change the world. So progressive political movements will always attract the Jewish people. Here's the Jonathan Sacks quote. I just got out of place there for a minute. But he sums it up beautifully. This is a book he actually wrote as a present to his son before he got married. But I love the title because it says it all. Radical then, radical now. That's the Jewish people. And in it he writes, I am proud to belong to a people, Israel, whose name means one who wrestles with God and with man and prevails. For though we have loved humanity, we have never stopped wrestling with it, challenging the idols of every age. And though we have loved God with an everlasting love, we have never stopped wrestling with him, nor he with us. This is the Jewish personality. We're not into conformity, we're into changing the world, we're into big ideas, we're into think outside the box, and we don't care what other people think. So from the Jewish political perspective, however, what is, when I say Jewish political perspective, I say from the Torah worldview, what is the correct political affiliation? Do not worry, I'm not going to tell you how to vote. I wouldn't be that stupid to tell an audience of Jews how to vote. But there's a couple of points we need to be clear on before we do vote. And people often ask me, like, who should I vote for? I say, first of all, it's not my business. But I do tell people that if I was going to vote, I would, A, being a Torah-observant Jew, vote for the candidate whose values is as close to that worldview, because that's the system we get, the moral system we have, and also to vote for a candidate who has integrity, obviously, because talk is cheap. How does the person actually act? But as to this question specifically, number one point we have to appreciate, it's a mistake to believe that liberalism and Judaism are the same thing. Okay? While the roots of liberalism come largely from Judaism, they are not the same ideology. And by the way, they often diverge and are often confrontational in terms of certain specific political issues. But it's also a mistake to believe that Judaism would advocate a specific political party. The way I like to put it is, God is an independent and his political platform is the Torah. And that's how Jews, I believe, should be making political decisions. Based on the wisdom that we brought to the world that has so impacted the world, why are we leaving that on the side now when we're making decisions about which politicians and which forms of government to support? The person who said this best is Abraham Joshua Heschel. You guys heard of Heschel? He's one of the great Jewish thinkers of the 20th century and one of the leading thinkers of the conservative movement in America. But he really hits the nail on the head when he says, the spirit of Judaism is not the spirit of conformity to American secular society, but above all, it is the spirit of protest, embodied in the great prophets against the confusion of the true God with many earthly false idols of this society. To be a Jew is to renounce allegiance to false gods, to remain free of infatuation with worldly triumphs, and never to succumb to splendor. And that's, I think, a really nice way of putting it. We're supposed to just be independent thinkers, but use our Torah as our guidebook and be into certain values. And with using those values, that's how we should be making our political decisions in this world. But if we go back, and I want to bring the whole thing to a conclusion now and come back full circle. We talked about the political process of Europe, how, it really wasn't this whole secular thing that created the modern world. But it's very true that for the last few centuries, and it sped up dramatically in the last century, Western civilization and Europe specifically has largely become post-religious, or I would say post-Christian specifically. Most of Europe is in that sense today. Very different from the way it was hundreds of years ago. What percentage of people in the European Union, the EU, believe in God today? Now remember, keep in mind, this was Christendom 1,000 years ago, where the primary identity, when states didn't even, like many countries didn't even exist, people's primary identity was I'm a Christian. What percentage believe in God? 10%. It's actually a lot higher than that. It's actually 52%. It varies tremendously from place to place. By the way, believing in God doesn't mean they're religious. Now, of course, religious Christianity, there's not so much to do. They don't have mitzvot. But a good indication is going to church, for instance, on a regular basis. England, which is one of the most religious countries in Western Europe, where at least half the population believes in God, and 90% is Anglican. Do you know more Muslims in England go to mosque on Friday than Anglicans go to church on Sunday? It says a lot about the Muslim teeny minority of the country's strong religious beliefs versus the basically lip service they're paying to a concept of God. But the question is, so who cares? Many people argue that religion served its purpose in the political evolution and the moral evolution of the Western world, and now it's basically a has-been concept, and Europe has evolved past it, and Western civilization has gotten past it. I've often dealt with this question, I'm sure you've thought about, isn't it enough that I'm a good person? Anyone ever thought of this issue? Every one of us has at some point dealt with this issue. So I want to say, as a human being, as a Jew, as a rabbi, as a historian, as every other criteria I could use, the following that I believe to be true. Just because you're religious doesn't make you a good person. Some very evil things have been done in the name of God. Okay, some of the most evil things in human history. Nor does making you an atheist make you a bad person. I have an uncle who's like an atheist. He claims to be. He's pretty strongly anti-religious, yet he is an extremely moral, caring. He's one of the most altruistic people I know. On a micro level, individuals, it doesn't make that much difference, it seems. But I could tell you, and as Lord Bolingbroke said, the British Lord, history is philosophy with examples. On a macro level, boy, does it make a difference. When entire populations collectively move away from God, it has a huge impact. And the person who said it beautifully, and this I think is the most powerful point of the whole presentation, is this guy. His name is Will Herberg, and he was an American Jewish social thinker from the mid-20th century. He created an idea called the cut flower ethics. And pay really careful attention to this quote. It is powerful. The attempt made in recent decades by secular thinkers to disengage the moral principles of Western civilization from their scripturally based religious context in the assurance that they could live a life of their own as, quote, humanistic ethics, has resulted in the cut flower culture. Cut flowers retain their original beauty and fragrance, but only so long as they retain the vitality that they have drawn from their now severed roots. After that is exhausted, they wither and die. So with the freedom, brotherhood, justice, and personal dignity, the values that form the moral foundation of our civilization. Without the life-giving power of faith out of which they have sprung, they possess neither meaning nor vitality. That's a very powerful idea. And this is largely the idea behind what I perceive, and many people perceive, to be the moral, spiritual decay of Western civilization. And I think the person who summed it up the best is the British author G.K. Chesterton. I love this quote. Sometimes the shortest quotes are the most powerful. When men stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they believe in anything. That's also probably the best description of the average college student. No, I kid you not. It is unbelievable. Try telling an American college student about anything being absolute. Oh my God, you have to be open to everything. This is not an idea that Judaism certainly believes in. If we look at the state of religion in the Western world today, I would basically say the entire Western world is suffering from ADD, which is not attention deficiency disorder like our kids all have, but rather almighty deficiency disorder. We need a dose of that good old-fashioned religion. By the way, I'm not advocating for fanatical religious beliefs. I could tell you as a historian, if you want to live as a Jew and you don't want to stay in Israel, which is the best place to be, if you're going to live in diaspora, you do not want to live in some atheist, communist, godless country, nor do you want to live in a fanatically religious place like Iran. You want to live in a moderately religious country with people who have values but are still tolerant, but believe in a God-based system of rights and wrongs that keeps them from being crazy. and doing horrible things. But the point is, let's go to the United States to finish up. Back where we started from. What percentage of Americans believe in God? I love this statistic. It's unbelievable. About 92%. America is the most religious country in the Western world. I don't know about South America, might be these Catholic countries even tied to this. But only 86% of Israelis believe in God, but that's a lot. But 92, but we know why we don't know this, because we don't get exposed to Middle America. I just can't, go to like Tennessee or Montana and play. It's unbelievable how the center, the South, every other building is a church and every TV station is a Bible channel. It's unbelievable. We just see Hollywood and New York and whatever, and this is not really what America is about. But how about the Jews? The people who brought God into the world. What percentage of Jews in the United States today believe in God? And this is a very interesting statistic. Before we look at it, Mordecai Kaplan, who's the founder of the Reconstructionist movement, points out something very interesting about the process that we Jews have gone through in the last 100. So this is the experience of our grandparents, our parents, our great-grandparents. He says, before the beginning of the 19th century, all Jews regarded Judaism as a privilege. Since then, most Jews have come to regard it as a burden. And he's saying this in 1934, before the intermarriage rate hit 50% plus in America, when it was less than 6%, by the way. But Jonathan Sacks gives a beautiful summary of what has happened to the collective Jewish psyche vis-a-vis connection to God and religion in the Western world today. He says, I believe that at a certain period in history, Jews lost their faith in God and placed their trust in man. That has been the story of Western civilization as a whole, but it happened to the Jews more suddenly and poignantly than to anyone else. Beginning with the French Revolution, a new secular dispensation seemed to answer their prayers, and they invested it with all the hopes of a profoundly religious people. And basically, much of the modern Western liberal ideology became the religion of the Jews, replacing traditional Judaism, because we don't do anything halfway. We so bought into the ideology of modern Western liberal thinking, believing that that would be the solution to all the horrible things that we suffered through. This, which explains why we, of all people, move further away from God than the general population in the United States. As to the exact numbers, this is a pretty recent article. It's the last statistics I'm going to really show you now. But this is from an article. Look, this is April 20th, 2012. Here's the title of the article. Are you their God? It's us, the Jews. Can religion, especially Judaism, work if you don't believe in the big guy upstairs? And look what it says. It's a very telling quote. According to the Public Religion Research Institute survey on American Jewish values released this month, religious observance was a distant third in what Jews described as the most important quality of their Jewish identity. The most common answer at roughly 50%, look at this, a commitment to social equality. Followed by support for Israel at 20%. Religious observance, the closest quality to something like belief, was cited as the most important quality of Judaism in only 17% of the time. And when asked whether Jews of any kind believed in God, 18% said they did not, 40% said they believed in an impersonal God, while only 26% said they believed in a God they saw as a person with whom they could have a relationship with. By the way, if we look at a statistic about what percent of Jews are liberal versus, you put that number together with the percentage before, what do you get? I think there's a direct correlation, about 100%. You know, I think it's a direct correlation. If you did study further, you'd find that there's a direct correlation. Who do you think are the people who are the Jewish community of America that believes there's a God you can have a personal relationship with? Overwhelmingly, it's going to be which community? Obviously, the religious community. Which, by the way, is the one community in Israel. In America, if you divide political affiliation, what do you see, by the way? Orthodox Jews versus the Jewish population at large tend to vote which side? It's interesting. They tend to be the more conservative ones. Interesting. There's a connection there between the political affiliation and the religious connection. Okay, but just to come to a close, you look at the Jewish world today, and we see we're in a very sad state of affairs in many respects. Heschel himself said the Jewish people are messengers that have basically forgotten the message. Today we basically have Jews for every ism but Judaism. And by the way, if you take any cause to make the world a better place, in the last 100 years, communism, socialism, feminism, black civil rights, anti-apartheid, Doctors Without Borders, Amnesty International, you name it, I will show you. If it isn't founded by Jews, it's overwhelmingly disproportionately run by Jews. Because nothing gets a Jew more excited than trying to fix the world. But the problem is twofold. One, it's Jews for every ism but Judaism, and not only that, all these causes are just putting Band-Aids on symptoms of deeper problems. And our job has always been not to found causes, but to change the world's values. Bottom line the Light to Nations needs a recharge. Okay, absolutely. We have Jews for every ism but Judaism. So much Jewish energy is being focused into so many different areas that are not even connected to the Jewish people. To the point where, in terms of mega Jewish gifts, 96% of Jewish giving is going to non-Jewish causes. I'm not saying this out of a desire to get more money for us Jews because it's a tribal thing. It's out of a very profound understanding of this point, that Jews for Judaism make better people for the world. And if we don't have Jews for Judaism, we're not going to have Jews at all, by the way. Because when Jews lose their Jewish connection, within a few generations, they're just gone. And if we see how much we've impacted the world, God knows we need the Jewish people today, but we need Jews who are connected and educated. Thomas Cahill summed it up beautifully. He wrote a book called The Gift of the Jews. Anyone read this book? Yeah. I actually love the book. That has a couple of pages that are awesome. I'm more upset with him because I couldn't get my first book, World Perfect, published for 2 years because of his book. My book has nothing to do with his, but because his book is The Gift of the Jews, and mine is The Jewish Impact on Civilization. By the way, if you're thinking of publishing a book, the lesson is publishers never look at the inside, they just look at the title. But anyway, it happens to have a couple of beautiful quotes in it. And Cahill says the following: unbelievers might wish to stop for a moment and consider how completely God, this Jewish God of justice and compassion, undergirds all of our values, and that it is just possible that human effort without this God is doomed to certain failure. All who share this outrageous dream of universal brotherhood, peace, and justice, who dream the dreams and see the vision of the great prophets, must bring themselves to contemplate the possibility that without God there is no justice. And without the Jewish people in history, there'd be no concept of God. And when the world today is losing its whole God-based value system, which is the foundation of Western civilization, now more than ever, the world needs Jews for Judaism for the sake of the human race. It's an absolutely fundamental thing. And I think it's fitting to end with a quote from the most popular American president of all time, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's speaking to the American people in a fireside chat in 1935, but I believe the words still hold very true today, not just for us as Jews, but for the entire human race. We cannot read the history of our rise and development as a nation without reckoning with the place the Bible is occupied in shaping the advances of the Republic. Where we have been truest and most consistent in obeying its precepts, we have attained the greatest measure of contentment and prosperity. And thank you very much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM. To GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.